When a B cell or B lymphocyte binds to an antigen, it initiates what's called the humoral immune response. It's humoral because the B cells are producing something that they pump into the body fluids. And an old term for body fluids were the humors of the body. So here, we're looking specifically at those things that are pushed into the body fluids as part of our immune response. Those things that the B cells are producing are called antibodies. Each antibody we make is specific for working against one type of antigen. Antibodies mark those antigens for destruction by other immune cells. Antibodies don't do so much destroying on their own. They serve as red flags or markers that signal something else needs to be destroyed by a T cell or a macrophage or some other component of the immune system. What happens when we are first exposed to an antigen is it initiates something that's called the primary response, because this is the first time we've been exposed to that antigen. Let's say we're exposed to the chickenpox. The chickenpox is a virus that once it gets into our cells starts to produce some kinds of antigens, markers that signal that this cell has been infected by a type of virus. We don't have the correct kind of B cell to immediately mount a defense against this viral infection. Instead, we have to go through this process of randomly generating B cells in the hopes that one of them will eventually make an antibody of the correct three-dimensional shape to mark this antigen for destruction. Once we've produced that B cell, that cell gets activated, starts to proliferate, divide, and make clones of itself. Most of the cells that are produced during this time period are what's called plasma cells or effector B cells. These are the cells that are actively pumping out antibodies into the circulatory system and lymphatic system, trying to mark those antigens for destruction. But some of the cells made during this time are what are called memory cells. They're called memory cells because if we're ever exposed to that same antigen again, like if we have a second exposure to the chickenpox, we don't have to go through that process of learning how to make the B cell all over again. We already have this B cell available, which immediately activates, starts to proliferate, divide, pump out antibodies, and recreate memory cells so that if we're exposed in the future, we have the same kind of response. This second exposure is what we call the secondary response. We're relying on those memory cells to immediately become active, immediately start proliferating, and immediately start pumping out a large number of antibodies. If we're ever exposed to the same antigen a third time, like the third time you're exposed to the chickenpox, you still go through the same secondary response because the mechanism looks the same. A memory cell that's already available immediately becomes active, divides, and starts pumping out antibodies. The way this happens, if we were to graph it out in a calendar kind of way, is if we're exposed to an antigen on day 0, at this point, we don't have a B cell that makes an antibody of the correct three-dimensional shape to mark that antigen. So we have to go through a period of randomly generating B cells and hoping that one of them makes an antibody of the correct three-dimensional shape. Your bone marrow starts to pump out millions of cells at a time, and eventually, usually somewhere around day 6-ish or so, you wind up making a B cell that produces an antibody of the correct three-dimensional shape. Once that cell is available, it gets selected for clonal selection, starts to divide into plasma cells that produce a large number of antibodies. The cell production and antibody production peaks usually somewhere around day 9 or 11, and then once we mount a defense against that antigen, it starts to taper off. If we're ever exposed to the same antigen a second time, we initiate what's called the secondary immune response. We don't have to go through the same learning process because we already have memory cells available. They immediately activate, start to divide, and pump out antibodies, and we have this fast, massive response. You don't normally get sick from the chickenpox a second time because of this massive secondary immune response. If we're exposed to a different kind of antigen, let's say a different virus, like the flu, the antibodies we make that are specific for chickenpox will not be specific for the flu. So we have to go through the same learning process, primary response, and then secondary response after exposure to this second kind of antigen. This humoral immune response that involves antibodies can be active, meaning you are exposed to an active form of the antigen and you actively have to produce your own B cells, which produce their own antibodies. Or it can be passive, meaning you get antibodies from an outside source and you never really learn how to make the correct kind of B cell on your own. The active kind of response, where you are exposed to an active antigen and have to produce your own B cells, can happen in a natural kind of way. You can be infected by that pathogen, like getting sick from the chickenpox, and in that process, you have to learn how to make the correct kind of B cells that make the correct kind of antibodies. This can also happen in an artificially acquired active kind of way, like vaccines. In vaccines, you're exposed to a dead or attenuated form of the pathogen that is much less likely to divide in the body. Because you are exposed to those antigens, you still have to go through the process of learning how to make the correct kind of B cell that makes the correct kind of antibody. The downside to this active kind of humoral immunity is that it does take time. You have to go through that learning process and mount the primary response. The benefit is that because you made your own B cells, you are going to have immunological memory. Those B cells will be available if you ever get exposed to the same antigen again. In a passive humoral response, we receive antibodies from an outside source. This can also happen in a natural kind of way. There are some antibodies that can pass from a mother to a fetus through the placental sac, and any antibody the mother is making that helps in defense against an antigen she may have been exposed to could also provide some immune response or immune capability to the fetus. After birth, if the mother breastfeeds, she's also producing antibodies as part of her breast milk that are going to the baby that's feeding. That baby is now going to have antibodies to any antigen that the mother may have been exposed to. This passive kind of humoral immunity can also happen in an artificial type of way. We can receive an injection of antibodies from an outside source, like if you're exposed to a snake bite or a toxic venom, the antitoxin we use to help defend against that is a type of antibody. The plus side of this passive kind of humoral immunity is that with these antibodies coming from an outside source, we have immediate access to those antibodies. We can mount immediate kind of response to destroy that antigen. The downside is we never learned how to make our own kind of B cell, and so we're not going to have immunological memory. If we get exposed to that same antigen after those antibodies have degraded, we won't have a defense mounted against that antigen.